Hey Max, how's it going?
Hey, so good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. This is a pleasure.
Okay, of course. Okay, so I like to ask every guest before we get started, what does keto mean to you?
Oh man. Well, to me, it's sort of like a default state of metabolism for human beings. I mean, it's something that I feel that, just through the lens of evolution, it makes a lot of sense that we would have spent at least some, if not most of our time in a ketogenic state, because food availability is not something that we were really able to rely on up until the advent of agriculture and supermarkets and most recently obviously food delivery apps. So our bodies have been sort of honed, chiseled in a way to be able to oscillate between a fed and fasted state, and I think that food has never been more plentiful than it is now. And so keto to me is just it's paying homage, I think, in a way to millions of, and if not billions of years of evolution that really have, caused this adaptation within us to be able to use our own fat for fuel. And too frequently today, I think people thwart their ability to use fat for fuel because they're chronically fed. And to me, it's sort of like, I consider ketones almost a birthright fuel is how I describe them.
That's amazing. I've never heard it that way, but it's so beautifully said. Yes, I totally agree with you. And how did you get into this work? I know
Uh,
that's a loaded question, but I'd love to know.
yeah, no, I mean, I've been an early adopter, although I think people are, in the nutrition space might be familiar with me only over the past couple of years. But just personally, I've been really interested in nutrition for my entire life. Well, beginning in high school, I was a sort of computer programmer, introvert. I played a lot of video games, and I was never athletic in any capacity, but I discovered bodybuilding actually because there was a supplement store close to my high school in New York City. And it wasn't like a GNC, it was more of like a mom and pop shop. And the guy that was always there when school would let out was very knowledgeable. And I just kind of, I don't know, probably, a confluence of factors, the fact that, I was not athletic and I was maybe unhealthily obsessed with superheroes at the time. I saw supplements as being this sort of way to, like tinctures and potions and powders that could help me transcend my meager stature at the time. And I just became fascinated by them. And, obviously there's a lot of marketing hype, and I very, early on became privy to that. But nonetheless, I started doing, deep dives into whatever literature I could find. And ultimately I became a frequent user of message boards. I think they were called news groups at the time.
Mhm.
And there were some related to fitness and bodybuilding. And I stumbled upon this book, probably the first book written for, not necessarily an academic crowd, written by Lyle McDonald, called The Ketogenic Diet back in 1990, like seven, I want to say, or something like that. And I read this book, and it was really fascinating. There were no lots and lots of references, no diagrams, pictures, or anything like that. It was really made for like an enthusiast for physiology and nutrition. And I read that, and it just kind of blew my mind. And fast forward 15 years later, 20 years later, I still harbored this passion for nutrition and health, and it was very much a private sort of enterprise for me. But a couple of years ago now, maybe like 8 years ago, my mother started to develop the earliest symptoms of dementia, and I started looking into modifiable risk factors that might have predisposed my mom to developing that condition, and also non-pharmacologic interventions that are being used that might, potentially help, or even, potentially have a disease modifying effect. And of course, when diving into the literature and just kind of what people are talking about in regards to nutrition and these kinds of conditions, it's not long before one stumbles upon ketosis and ketogenic diets and how that pertains to conditions like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. And so I had no idea 15 years ago that I would ultimately circle back to this interest in ketones and things like that. But it's become a major focus for me because of, obviously the role that ketones play in brain health and brain function. And, I'd like to report that my mom is on a ketogenic diet. I wish I could report that, but she's not. But for me, as somebody who's interested in the prevention of these kinds of conditions, uh, ketogenic dieting and supplementation, they're all a major part of my protocol and routine. And we can get into the specifics of it. But yeah, I mean, I think that the research, 5 years ago was already compelling, and it just is continuing to get even more and more convincing that tactic measure for these kinds of conditions, which didn't exist in antiquity, really.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned your protocol, and something you are quite good at. I love your Instagram pictures where you're showing different food together and showing the differences of the nutrients. When I first got started with keto 5 years ago, it was like bacon, 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 butter, bacon, bacon, butter. Can we chat a little bit about how your protocol is different and what you found with your experience?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's one of the major, when people first discover ketogenic diets, especially these days, because there's so much media and there's so many books coming out about them, their approach can be kind of I guess a more reckless approach towards it. In part because, when you start to increase your fat intake, and a ketogenic diet, for those, I mean, your listeners are obviously very savvy, but it's a very high percentage of calories from fat. And once you start to titrate up your fat intake, it becomes critically important the types of fats that you're consuming. And I would say the other major conception is that, the ketogenic diet needs to be a high fat diet. I think that you can eat well, first of all, you can be in deep ketosis by consuming no fat whatsoever. And this is a natural physiological response to starvation, right? And we obviously don't want to starve. We want to, I mean, the ketogenic diet really is a way of hacking and eating a diet that really serves as a starvation mimetic in a way, meaning that it mimics the physiological response to starvation without actually needing to be in a starved state. But so, what are the kinds of foods that are not going to, quote unquote, knock you out of ketosis? Well, fat, because fat doesn't have an insulinogenic response. It certainly doesn't elevate blood sugar. And so, we build these diets around fat. But early iterations of the ketogenic diet, especially those that, are described in medical literature for treatments for epilepsy, the ketogenic diet has been used as a treatment for hard to treat epilepsy for almost a century now. It's really a diet that focuses around heavy cream and cheese and, high fat meats, and they don't stipulate as to, is the meat grass fed or is it grain fed? They don't, in those early ketogenic studies, they didn't really care where the fat was coming from. Whereas now I think we know that the kinds of fat that you consume really dictate the moment-to-moment quality of your brain function, how you feel, your capacity to burn fat, and ultimately your long-term health too. So, I would say the biggest misconceptions include the fact that, we should be eating lots and lots of butter and bacon, and that, that really isn't true. You can be on a ketogenic diet, eating lots and lots of fibrous veggies, and that's really the iteration of the ketogenic diet that I practice. Because I think now we know that, fiber is very beneficial, phytonutrients, plant pigments like lutein, zeaxanthin, lycopene, these are powerful antioxidants. And, I don't think that, that a diet that excludes those kinds of foods really is going to be, over the long haul, all that beneficial. So I think it's about marrying both schools of thought, that ketogenic dieting and things like that, very, potentially beneficial, but the power of veggies can't be discounted either.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. When I realized that, glucose burning state is a glucose burning state, and there are thousands of diets that you can manipulate food in order to stay in a glucose burning state and get maybe the results you want. And then with keto, I think we all have this belief. I mean, it's changing, but when I got into it 5 years ago, it was very much like keto is keto. There's one way to keto, but just like there's thousands of ways to do this glucose burning thing, there's gotta be a bunch of different ways to do this keto thing. So I think it's really great. I totally agree with you that plants now play a much bigger role in my life than the bacon. If somebody's wanting to implement more healthy practices into their daily routine, what should they prioritize? What should be their main focus?
Oh man. I mean, man, there's so many ways to answer that question, but I think diet is obviously a huge player. I think, focusing on nutrient density, cutting out the packaged processed foods, that misconception surrounding keto, I think, is a major one. Like I think that the jury on saturated fat, when we look at the population as a whole, it seems that saturated fat is not the dietary demon that it once was, right? We can look, most recently, there's some really interesting observational level evidence that full fat dairy is better for us than low fat dairy, which is a great thing, right? Low fat dairy or fat free dairy is a processed food, whereas full fat dairy is, obviously going to be less processed, contains all the fat soluble nutrients that we need. But dairy is the only food group where there's more saturated fat than unsaturated fat. And if saturated fat was really that unhealthy for us, you'd think that people that consume more full fat dairy would have increased risks of, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes. And actually the opposite is true, that they have a reduced risk. Their metabolisms seem to be, functioning better when they consume full fat dairy. So that being said, if the average health of a population improves when people consume higher levels of saturated fat containing foods, those averages aren't really designed to reflect how the outliers are doing, the small group of people within that population that maybe have genes that cause them to over-respond to saturated fat. So I think, in terms of precision, personalized nutrition, I still think it requires a little bit of experimentation. I personally am still mindful of where my fats come from. And, I would much quicker cover my food in extra virgin olive oil, which is higher in unsaturated fat, and also, phytochemicals, polyphenols, things like that, than I would butter. Which isn't to say that butter is unhealthy. I cook with butter. It's a very stable fat for high heat cooking, obviously, and things like that. But, I think the fat question is really kind of critical. And I like to remind people that the oil or the dietary fat that has the sort of strongest body of evidence in support of it as being your sort of chief dietary oil is extra virgin olive oil. So, and I'm not paid by Big Olive either. So, but yeah, I think, optimizing sleep is also critically important. People like to try, dietary change for most people is one of the hardest things to really accomplish. And it becomes infinitely more difficult when we're underslept and stressed out. So, optimizing your sleep, reducing sources of chronic stress, or learning how to better manage that stress in your life, I think is really important. And also physical exercise. I mean, physical exercise is critically important. And that ranges from, NEAT or non-exercise activity thermogenesis, meaning like taking the stairs, dancing, using a standing desk. These are all things that are not exercise, but they, boost your metabolic rate. They're really good for your, it's good for your metabolism. And then also exercise, everything from aerobic exercise to high intensity interval training to resistance training. I think these are all really critical parts of the puzzle. And yeah, so it would be hard for me to say that there's any one area that's more important than others. It's sort of like a pie, and you want to really make sure that all those aspects are optimized.
Completely. It's never just one thing.
Yeah, exactly.
One of our Keto Unlimited members, Marnie, she wanted to ask you, she follows your content quite well. And I guess once you said that the damage to your brain starts 30 years before the signs ever show up. And she was just wondering what your recommendations were for like the top 3 things, understanding it's still a pie, things that you can do now to prevent that from happening?
Yeah. Well, so that, idea that dementia and in particular Alzheimer's disease begins in the brain decades before the first symptom, what they've seen, the biomarker that they've identified that's associated with Alzheimer's disease that is measurable decades before the first symptom is reduced glucose metabolism in the brain. And this is true of people that carry the genetic risk factor, or the most well-defined genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, the ApoE4 allele. And so what they found is that these people have reduced glucose metabolism, but the brain's ability to use ketones as a source of fuel is undeterred by that gene variant. And so, so I would say one of the things that I think that, that I theorize, and long-term, studies in humans have not been done and probably won't, be completed for quite a while, is to be in a state of ketosis, at least intermittently, to allow these sort of, this alternate fuel substrate to make its way up to the brain, and to allow your brain to, continue to create energy. Whereas it might, have trouble doing that with, if the only fuel that you supply it through your lifespan is glucose. The other thing, I think vascular health is really important. Similarly with the heart attack, if you have a heart attack, it's not something that began the night before you having a heart attack. This is a decades-long process. Nurturing vascular health, I think, is critically important. And one of the things that I've been really interested in lately is the role that vitamin D plays in vascular health. So I would say getting, adequate sun exposure is critically important. And vitamin D, one of the mechanisms by which vitamin D protects your vasculature is by reducing what's called arterial stiffness. Arterial stiffness is something that tends to increase with age. And in people that are genetically at risk for Alzheimer's disease, it might actually markedly reduce blood flow to the brain. So getting adequate levels of vitamin D, whether it's, through sun exposure, or in the winter months, taking a vitamin D supplement. I believe the Institute of Medicine's current upper tolerable or upper safe intake for vitamin D is 4,000 international units. I think that's pretty important. And then also when it comes to the metabolism, which is important, maintaining insulin sensitivity, to the best of your ability. And to me, what that means is, cutting out the kinds of foods that are going to keep insulin chronically elevated throughout the day. There was a research calculation performed and published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease that speculated that, or I guess it wasn't a speculation, it was an estimate rather, that 40% of Alzheimer's cases might be owed to chronically elevated insulin alone. So, if you're on a ketogenic diet, obviously you're checking those boxes. But yeah, what I like to do is I like to be very deliberate with my, consumption of foods that are going to spike insulin. I like to keep insulin, pulsatile and in particular, deliberately targeted towards when I want that growth stimulus in my body, which is usually going to be after a vigorous workout.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on the ApoE gene? Because these people who have this can't metabolize saturated fat well. So what are your thoughts on those people being in the ketogenic diet? Because what I've noticed lately is a lot of people say, well, I can't be keto because I don't, I have the ApoE gene, E4 gene, and therefore I can't eat a ketogenic diet. And my response is always, but you can still do monounsaturated fat. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And I kind of alluded to that earlier, but yeah, I mean, if you take a large population and you feed them lots of butter, maybe we'll see that on average, the health of the population improves. But ApoE4 carriers make up only a quarter of the population, so there could be a group within that population that's actually suffering potentially, and we don't actually really know how an ApoE4 responds to saturated fat, but it's sort of believed that ApoE4 carriers are less effective at recycling lipoproteins in the body. And this machinery that recycles these lipoproteins that can potentially become atherogenic rely on LDL receptors in the liver. And one of the mechanisms by which saturated fat tends to raise cholesterol is that it reduces the number of LDL receptors on the surface of the liver. And so for ApoE4 carriers, where it's believed, it's not, this is not the medical consensus by any means, but it's believed that ApoE4s can use a little extra help when it comes to recycling these lipoproteins, so they don't become small and dense and, ultimately, present a risk to your endothelium. Maybe cut down on the saturated fat intake. Maybe full fat dairy is not ideal for ApoE4 carriers. I don't claim to, have an answer with certainty, but, this is just something where, for people that are at risk for Alzheimer's disease, i.e. carriers of the ApoE4 allele among them, I think maybe using less butter, more extra virgin olive oil, less hard cheeses and things like that, more, I guess, hard cheese would be the one area where I feel that, it's obviously going to be a much higher concentration of saturated fat. So it's an area for me where I feel safe, like cutting that out of my diet. I think that's probably a smart idea. It's always wise. I think, people in the nutrition community, we always want like concrete answers, right? But there are questions for which concrete answers do not exist. Yeah. So in the interim, I think it's always smart for people like us. I know we're always trying to push the envelope, but I think it's really smart for people, especially when it comes to like our long-term health and the decisions that we make day to day. I think it's wise to hedge your bets in a way. And so, I've cut the hard cheeses out of my diet. I don't miss them. I'll use butter occasionally. Occasionally I'll put a little bit in my coffee because I enjoy the taste, but I'm not kidding myself into thinking that that's, it's making my coffee healthier by doing that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's wise. And science needs to further elucidate the role that, that diet plays specifically for ApoE4s. But, in the meantime, there's so many other healthy, delicious, high fat foods, and you don't need to consume more saturated fat to be on a ketogenic diet at all, as you mentioned.
Yeah, it's so true. Okay. Speaking about delicious fats and delicious things that are also good for you, I'd like to pick your brain on biohacking a little bit with like simple things. How did you get into biohacking, or what's your relationship with it right now?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I guess I've been like an early adopter, and biohacking is sort of a new term, but I think what it means to me is really kind of staying up on the latest research and utilizing technology to take a systems approach in terms of optimizing your health. So whether that means really getting to know your health report on 23andMe, to using a sleep tracker if you're not sure how, whether or not your sleep is, optimized, or even calorie tracking for some people that have no concept of, how many calories are in the foods that they're eating. These are all ways of just, I think, getting a broader understanding of how our choices and our environment affect our biology. I would say for me, the majority of hacking, quote unquote, that I do is not so much to my biology, but to my environment. The modern environment has become so far removed from the environment, in which we evolved, that to me, I find most of my efforts are put towards like hacking the environment, whether that means, wearing blue blockers before I go to sleep, which is probably one of the most beneficial things that I think anybody can do in the modern world when, screen exposure is so ever present. I think blue blockers are pretty important. I wear them. People can, go to I think I put the link to the ones that I wear on my website. Yeah, cold showers. We live in a world that loves to keep us within this very narrow range of comfort. I call it chronic climate control. And so, I hack my environment by regularly exposing myself to variations in temperature, whether that means standing out on my terrace in the winter without a shirt. I call it free cryo. to taking cold showers or sitting in a sauna. These are ways of circumventing the fact that the modern world really has made it very difficult for our bodies to receive a stimulus that compels it to grow stronger and more resilient. And I think that's ultimately what we all want, is to become more robust. These are the things that I do that I feel, and research backs me up, can help us become more robust and resilient. And really, they're ancient solutions to modern problems at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amazing. So you mentioned cold showers, blue blocking. Would meditation, do you feel like meditation falls under hacking a little bit because the brain and moods and all the things?
I definitely think it is a way of hacking like modern chronic psychological stress. People are more anxious than ever before. And, meditation is a way of, it's an ancient practice again, but it's a way of kind of tuning out the noise. And, I would be remiss to not admit that I'm not a very disciplined meditator. So I have a practice, but I don't meditate all that regularly, which is something that I'm trying to get better at. But yeah, I think meditation is incredibly powerful. I mean, I definitely know when I need to meditate, and I dose myself accordingly.
Yeah. Yeah, same with me. I picked up meditation when I was quite young, not really knowing what it was, but my mom made me do it when I was a kid. So it's just a thing I thought all people did. So I'm so thankful to my mother for teaching me at such a young age that it's just part of what I do, like brushing my teeth. So
Very lucky.
thanks,
That's
Mom.
awesome. Yeah.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit to chat about toxins, because we were chatting a little bit about environment, and something that I've noticed, especially over the last year after my husband and I sold our house, moved into an RV, got really close to Mother Nature, is how many toxins are in bath towels and sheets and just like everything, food containers. What are your thoughts on glass versus plastic, and just how to be less toxic overall?
Yeah. I mean, toxic exposure, I think it's major, and I'm definitely not an expert on the toxins in consumer products like towels. I mean, I can't really speak to that in an informed way. But air pollution is something that I've become really interested in, because there is a pretty strong link between air pollution and risk for Alzheimer's disease and even cognitive decline well before a disease would present itself. And going back to vascular health, air pollution is something that seems to be a pretty formidable enemy to vascular health. Acute exposures to high pollution areas causes a reduction in heart rate variability, which is very important, and that's not a good thing. And so, air pollution is something that I think is pretty critically important. Hormone disrupting chemicals in plastics, I think, this is also critical. There's also these chemicals in store receipts. So now whenever I, yeah,
I use my shirt. I'm like, thanks,
yeah,
or don't give it to me. I'm fine.
I do that too. I mean, it's sometimes I look at the wonderful people that check me out at the supermarket, and there's probably a number of confounding variables here, but I feel for them when they don't wear plastic gloves to handle these receipts, because they're touching them day in and day out. They're coated with a powder that acts like a powerful endocrine disruptor. And these chemicals are found in our plastics and plastic water bottles. And speaking of plastic, there is plastic in, sea salts and the fish that we're eating, and microplastics were recently identified in the human gut. So we live in a world that is becoming increasingly toxic, and, I wonder how the next couple of decades are going to pan out for humanity. But that being said, I think you can't drive yourself crazy, right? Because the stress, chronically stressing out about these things will drive you to an early grave as well. So it's about making these incremental steps and just arming yourself with knowledge and giving people these insights where, maybe now after listening to this, people will also grab the receipt with their shirts or their, sleeves, or have their, cashier put the receipt in the bag instead of handing it to them personally, or, maybe, foregoing the receipt if it's not a big purchase altogether, because of that insight. So, I think as long as we can arm ourselves with knowledge is power. And these are really the kinds of insights that I rely on day to day. And once you sort of have them in your memory bank, it becomes autonomic. You just kind of learn how to better navigate the world, while simultaneously reducing your exposure to these kinds of toxic chemicals.
Yeah, so true. And so you wrote a book. Can we chat a little bit about it and why you were called to write it?
Yeah, so it's called Genius Foods, and I was called to write it. I'm very passionate about helping people prevent dementia and Alzheimer's disease, and obviously that's going to be an uphill battle because my passion really is getting this information out to the younger people, and younger people don't tend to care about Alzheimer's disease and dementia. But my mother has dementia, and it's a horrible disease, and it's ravaging her brain. It's a major stress on the family, and I wouldn't wish dementia onto my worst enemy. So what I did with Genius Foods is, my goal was to write the ultimate Bible to dementia prevention, evidence-based, no BS, to really give you a roadmap to procuring your most optimal brain health today and decades into the future. But it's also kind of glazed, if you will, with this other burgeoning line of research called nutritional psychiatry, which shows us how the same steps that we can take that are going to help minimize our risk for developing Alzheimer's disease and dementia also make our brains work better in the here and now. So for people that are, anxious or depressed, or they feel like they can't focus, my book really is going to give you the tools to help shed brain fog and really, gain back your cognitive birthright, which is, optimal brain function. Having a brain that works as well as it ought to should be a right afforded to every single person. And unfortunately, for too many, it's a privilege. 1 in 7 younger people complain of memory problems. This is like a major thing. 1 in 6 adults is on or has tried a pharmaceutical drug, or not a pharmaceutical drug, a psychoactive drug. So, we're struggling with our brain function, and it's no secret that books about anxiety are selling like hotcakes at the local bookstore. So it's something that I think people really need. And I've been really pleasantly surprised. At this point, the book has been out for, I don't know, 3-4 months, and people are reporting crazy weight loss. I get messages from people that are like, I'm morbidly obese, and this book has helped me lose 80 pounds. I'm like, what? That's amazing. And so, it's all in there. I mean, it's like the best way to practice a ketogenic diet, the best way to begin to practice intermittent fasting, or time-restricted feeding, and some really robust, mechanism as well is written into the book. How to optimize each neurotransmitter. Whether you've got depression or ADHD, it gives you a lay of the land of where, the consensus really stands on the value of pharmaceuticals, which I don't place a stigma on at all, versus nutritional interventions. So I wrote it to be a Bible. I didn't know if I'd ever get to write a second book or anything like that. So I left nothing on the table. And I'm also not selling anything in it other than the information that's in it, and you obviously have to buy the book to get that. But my background is as a journalist. So really kind of communicating these ideas in a way that is compelling, to me really was my number one goal, and to get to help people, because I see dementia every day, and it's, as I said, it's terrible.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about your mom. My grandpa experienced the same thing, and it was the most challenging thing. And even as a teenager, I thought, like, I hope that no other human has to experience something like this. And to know what just about how brain health and stuff, it puts so much fuel to the fire. And I definitely see that passion in you. And I think that that's a great gift that you've probably gifted a lot of families. So thank you for putting it out there.
Oh man, it's, I wish my mom didn't have dementia, and that I would have never had to write the book, to be totally honest. But because of this stroke of bad luck, or whatever it is, my mom's diet over the years or her lifestyle, it's impossible for me to isolate the smoking gun in my mom's life. But, for millions of other people around the world, this is something that we have a really profound window of opportunity to change our cognitive trajectory. And I recognize that young people, I only became interested in dementia because my mom developed dementia, right? Before my mom had developed dementia, dementia was not a word that was in my vocabulary. So anything about dementia, anything like that, I would have just glazed over, let alone listen to a guy in a white coat about, lecture me about it, right? So I recognize that there's a fundamental limitation that these doctors have to get this message of prevention out there to young people. And, I kind of seized the reins, when I realized this, to help, my generation, my peers better understand health and nutrition. And I don't, claim to have credentials that I don't. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not an academic scientist, although I've been trained over the past couple of years, obviously in science communication, and how to read papers and things like that. But this is something, health literacy is something that I think everybody should have, like universities do not own science, people with credentials after their name, certainly they're trained rigorously to get those credentials, but they don't own science. Science is it's a method of asking a question and investigating an answer. And I think it's something that we should all be trained in, the same way that, we should all have more literacy when it comes to cooking in the kitchen. We should all have more financial literacy. Health literacy is just one more aspect of, the human experience that I think in the era of specialization, we've just completely shed and outsourced to our quote unquote experts and professionals. And, if I break a bone, I'm going to the emergency room. If I have an infection, I'm going to the emergency room, and I'm letting trained professionals help and prescribe antibiotics or whatever it is that I need. But when it comes to true wellness, that's something that begins with you and it ends with you, and it's about the questions and, that you ask yourself and the decisions that you make when you're pushing the shopping cart through the supermarket, and whether, when you're debating with yourself whether or not you should get off your butt and go to the gym. That's really the source of wellness. And I just hope to try to help people, I guess, better understand that.
Yeah. So beautifully said. Where can people get your book? Because now I want a copy. What the heck?
Yeah, people can go to geniusfoodsbook.com, or they can pick it up anywhere they buy books. It's on Amazon. It's, at all the major bookstores. Yeah, it's everywhere. So Genius Foods is out there. And then also I have my own podcast now, which I launched recently. It's called The Genius Life. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can come and check me out over there. Just search The Genius Life. And I'm also very active on Instagram, as you mentioned. So come over, say hi. I love to connect with people. So
amazing. Max, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Cool.